The autumn sun cast long shadows through the apple trees as Nora Saunders stood frozen among the fallen leaves. Her black mourning dress a stark contrast to the vibrant reds and golds of the orchard she could no longer bear to tend alone. 6 months had passed since the fever took Robert, yet the weight of his absence felt heavier with each passing day, as though time itself conspired against her healing. Wyoming Territory, 1872. The small town of Pinecrest had seen its share of tragedy, but Nora's grief remained private, contained within the 5-acre orchard that had once been her husband's pride. At 26, she had not imagined herself a widow, struggling to maintain a homestead that required far more strength than she possessed. The harvest season had arrived with an abundance of fruit, and no hands to gather it. Nora knelt beside an overturned basket, apples scattered around her like casualties of her ineptitude. Her fingers, once delicate and adorned with fine embroidery, were now calloused and stained with dirt. She had been trying for days to harvest enough to sell in town, but her progress was painfully slow. "Madam, you all right there?" the deep voice startled her. Nora rose quickly, brushing leaves from her skirt as she turned toward the fence line. A tall man stood watching her, his hat tipped back to reveal a face weathered by sun and wind. He wore the practical attire of a working cowboy denim trousers, a faded shirt and worn leather chaps. His horse, a dappled gray, grazed contentedly behind him. "I'm fine, thank you," she answered stiffly, embarrassed to be caught in her moment of weakness. "Just gathering the last of the harvest." The stranger's eyes took in the sprawling orchard, the hundreds of apples still clinging to branches or dotting the ground. One eyebrow raised skeptically. "Looks like quite an undertaking for one person." Nora lifted her chin. "I manage." The man nodded, unconvinced. "Name's Vaughn Eastwood. I've taken work at the Rockingham Ranch down the valley. Passed by your orchard these last 3 days and noticed you working alone." Nora hesitated, propriety warring with desperation. "Nora Saunders," she finally offered. "This was my husband's orchard. He's no longer with us." Vaughn removed his hat, a gesture of respect that felt achingly sincere. "My condolences, Mrs. Saunders." "I don't mean to intrude, but those apples won't wait much longer." He glanced at the darkening sky. "Storm's coming in 2 days' time by my reckoning." Nora followed his gaze to the horizon. She knew he was right, the harvest needed to be completed, and soon. The orchard's yield was her only chance to earn enough money to survive the coming winter. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Eastwood, but I've got the afternoon free," he interrupted, already swinging one long leg over the fence. "And I'm mighty fond of apple pie." Before Nora could formulate a proper refusal, Vaughn had retrieved an empty basket from the ground and was efficiently gathering fallen fruit. His hands, large and calloused, moved with surprising gentleness as they selected only the unblemished apples. "Mr. Eastwood, I couldn't possibly accept. Not asking for payment, madam, just being neighborly." He glanced up, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Though I wouldn't say no to one of those pies I smell baking from your chimney." Against her better judgment, Nora found herself returning his smile. "It's apple butter, actually, for the mercantile in town, even better." Vaughn worked steadily, his tall frame reaching branches she couldn't touch. "You planning to sell all these at market?" Nora picked up her own basket, falling into step with him as they moved down the row. "Mr. Hollister at the general store takes most of them. The rest I preserve for winter." They worked in comfortable silence for nearly an hour. Vaughn filled 3 large baskets to her one, his efficiency both impressive and slightly humbling. When he carried the heavy loads to her small wagon, Nora noticed the easy strength in his movements, so different from Robert's scholarly posture. Her late husband had been a schoolteacher before purchasing the orchard on a dream and a prayer. "You've done this before," she observed as Vaughn climbed a tree to reach the highest fruits. He tossed down several perfect specimens before answering. "Grew up on an orchard in Missouri. Apples, peaches, pears. My father believed in diversification." His voice carried a hint of something deeper than casual conversation. Left when I was 18, wanted to see what lay beyond those neat rows of trees. And did you find it, whatever you were looking for? Vaughn descended with fluid grace, landing softly before her. Still looking, madam. Their eyes met briefly, and Nora felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. The afternoon passed more quickly than any since Robert's death. By sundown, they had harvested more apples than Nora had managed in the previous 3 days combined. Her wagon stood laden with fruit, ready for the journey to town. "I can't thank you enough," she said as Vaughn prepared to leave. True to her word, she'd wrapped a jar of apple butter and the pie she'd intended for her own supper. "My pleasure, Mrs. Saunders." He accepted the offerings with a slight bow. "Same time tomorrow, weather's holding for one more day." Nora hesitated only briefly. "That would be most appreciated, Mr. Eastwood." As he rode away, Nora realized she'd spent hours without feeling the crushing weight of her grief. The discovery was both comforting and unsettling, like finding a hidden door in a familiar room. Morning arrived with a promise of heat that belied the approaching autumn storm. Nora dressed with slightly more care than usual, exchanging her faded work dress for one less worn. She told herself it was merely a matter of practicality. The blue cotton was cooler for orchard work, but the lie rang hollow even in her own mind. Vaughn arrived precisely when he had the day before, this time bringing with him an additional ladder and several empty sacks. "Thought these might help," he explained, unloading them from his saddlebag. "Borrowed from the ranch. They won't miss them for a day." Nora thanked him, secretly relieved at his punctuality. She had feared he might not return, that his offer had been mere politeness rather than genuine intention. They established an efficient routine. Vaughn climbed the trees, carefully dropping apples into the outspread sacks below, while Nora sorted the harvest into crates based on quality and size. The best would go to market, the bruised ones to cider, and the rest would be preserved for her own use throughout winter. "Your husband planted a fine orchard," Vaughn commented, surveying the neat rows of trees. "John a Gold, Northern Spy, Baldwin, he knew his varieties." "Robert had grand dreams for this place," Nora said, surprised at how easily his name now came to her lips. "He studied pomology at a college back east, planned to develop new hybrids eventually." She gestured toward a separate section of smaller trees. Those were his experiments. Vaughn walked over to examine the younger trees. "Good grafting work, man knew his trade. He was a schoolteacher before we came west. Books were his first love, but this." She swept her arm to encompass the orchard. "This became his passion, and yours?" Vaughn asked, returning to the ladder. "Was it your passion as well?" Nora considered the question as she sorted apples. "I loved it because he did. I suppose I'm still learning to love it for myself." The admission felt dangerous somehow, as though acknowledging her ambivalence might dishonor Robert's memory. Yet Vaughn nodded with understanding rather than judgment. "Takes time to find your own reasons for doing a thing," he said simply. By mid-afternoon, the heat had intensified, driving them to seek shade beneath a particularly large apple tree. Nora had brought a jug of cool water and 2 tin cups. They sat at a respectful distance, backs against the gnarled trunk. "How long have you been in Pinecrest?" Nora asked, breaking the companionable silence. "Just 3 weeks. Ranch needed extra hands for the fall roundup." Vaughn took a deep drink. "I typically don't stay anywhere longer than a season. A true wanderer, then. Some might call it restless," he admitted with a self-deprecating smile. "Never found a reason compelling enough to put down roots. And your family in Missouri, don't they miss you?" A shadow crossed his features. "Parents passed on 5 years back. Fever took them both within a week of each other. Brothers sold the orchard, split the money. Nothing there for me now." The parallel to her own loss hung unspoken between them. Nora found herself reaching out, her hand briefly touching his forearm before propriety reasserted itself. "I'm sorry," she said, withdrawing quickly. "Losing loved ones. It leaves a hollow no one else can see." Vaughn's gaze met hers, recognition passing between them. Yet somehow you keep going, one day after another. Because what else is there to do? The question wasn't rhetorical. Nora had asked herself the same thing countless times during sleepless nights. Find new reasons, Vaughn suggested quietly. Build something different. The intimacy of the conversation startled Nora. She stood abruptly, brushing dust from her skirt. We should finish the north section before evening. Vaughn nodded, accepting the shift in mood without comment. They returned to work, the rhythm of their movements more subdued but no less efficient. By sunset, nearly 3/4 of the orchard had been harvested. I'll be in town tomorrow, Nora said as they loaded the last crates onto her wagon. Taking the first batch to market, but if you're available the following day. Storm's coming tomorrow night, Vaughn reminded her, glancing at the western horizon where clouds had begun to gather. Best to finish before it hits. I can come in the morning, help you with the last section. Relief and something warmer fluttered in Nora's chest. I would be most grateful, Mr. Eastwood. Vaughn, he corrected gently. If we're to be partners in this harvest, might as well use my given name. Nora hesitated only briefly. Vaughn, then, and I'm Nora. His smile transformed his weathered face, revealing a dimple in his right cheek that Nora found inexplicably charming. Good night, Nora. See you at first light. She watched him ride away, confusion and guilt warring within her. Robert had been gone only 6 months. To find another man's company pleasing felt like betrayal. Yet as she returned to her silent cabin, Nora couldn't deny the comfort Vaughn's presence had brought to her solitary existence. The third day of harvest dawned cooler, with ominous clouds building on the horizon. Nora had risen before first light to bake fresh bread and prepare a proper midday meal. She told herself it was simple hospitality repayment for Vaughn's generous assistance, but the extra care she took with her appearance belied that rationalization. Vaughn arrived as promised, this time leading a second horse with a small cart. Thought we might need this for the last section, he explained. Storm's moving faster than I expected. We'll need to work quickly. The remaining trees were the oldest in the orchard, their branches heavy with fruit, but more difficult to reach. Vaughn climbed fearlessly among them, occasionally telling stories of his boyhood in Missouri to pass the time. My brothers and I had contests, he called down as he filled another sack. Who could pick the most apples in an hour? Losers had to muck the horse stalls for a week. Did you win? Nora asked, securing a ladder against a particularly gnarled trunk. Vaughn's laughter drifted down. Not once. I was too careful, wanted every apple perfect. My brothers just grabbed anything with color. Quality over quantity, Nora observed. A philosophy I appreciate. Didn't spare me from the stink of those stalls, though. Their conversation flowed easily throughout the morning, punctuated by the satisfying thump of apples filling baskets. When midday arrived, Nora spread a simple meal in the shade: fresh bread, cheese, preserves, and cold cider. This is a feast, Vaughn declared, settling cross-legged on the blanket she'd laid out. Hardly that, Nora demurred, though pleased by his appreciation. Just practical food for hard work. Best meal I've had in months. Ranch cook believes salt is the only seasoning God intended. The wind picked up as they ate, carrying the unmistakable scent of approaching rain. The final section of the orchard remained unharvested, though they had made remarkable progress. We won't finish before the storm, Nora said, disappointment evident in her voice. But we've salvaged far more than I could have hoped. I can't thank you enough. Vaughn surveyed the remaining trees, his expression determined. We can finish if we hurry. Rain won't start for hours yet. He rose, extending a hand to help her up. Those last trees have the best fruit, be ashamed to lose them. Their fingers touched, and Nora felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with static electricity. She withdrew quickly, flustered by her reaction. You're right, she agreed, avoiding his gaze. Let's finish what we started. They worked with renewed urgency, Vaughn taking greater risks among the branches to speed their progress. The wind continued to strengthen. making the ladders less stable and the work more dangerous. Nora found herself watching him anxiously, heart in her throat each time he reached for a distant branch. "Please be careful," she called as he stretched precariously from the top rung. "The apples aren't worth broken bones. Worried about me, Nora." Vaughn teased, though he did retreat to a more secure position. Before she could answer, a powerful gust shook the trees. Vaughn lost his balance, tumbling backward from the ladder. He landed hard, a sharp crack accompanying his fall. "Vaughn." Nora rushed to where he lay, fear constricting her throat. He was conscious but grimacing in pain, one arm clutched protectively against his side. "Just winded," he insisted, attempting to sit up. His face paled with the effort, belying his words. "Don't move." Nora knelt beside him, gently probing his side. Vaughn inhaled sharply when her fingers found the injury. "I think you've broken a rib. We need to get you to the doctor. Town's too far with this storm coming." Vaughn managed to sit up despite her protests. "Just help me to my horse." "I'll make it back to the ranch." "Absolutely not." Nora's tone brooked no argument. "You can barely sit up, let alone ride. My cabin is just beyond those trees." Despite his continued protests, Vaughn was in no condition to refuse her assistance. With Nora supporting his uninjured side, they made slow progress toward the small cabin Robert had built when they first claimed the land. The first fat raindrops began to fall as they reached the porch, the sky darkening ominously above them. The cabin was modest but tidy, a single large room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture, and a curtained-off sleeping area. Nora helped Vaughn to the only comfortable chair, a padded rocker near the hearth. "We need to bind those ribs," she said, moving efficiently to gather supplies. "And you'll stay here until the storm passes." "I don't want to impose," Vaughn began, but a spasm of pain cut off his protest. "It's not an imposition when I'm insisting." Nora returned with strips of clean linen and a bottle of whiskey Robert had kept for medicinal purposes. "This will hurt, but it's necessary." Vaughn submitted to her ministrations with only minimal resistance, wincing as she helped him remove his shirt. Nora tried to maintain a clinical detachment as she wrapped the bandages around his torso, but the intimacy of the situation was undeniable. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, the muscles of his chest and shoulders clearly defined from years of physical labor. "You've done this before," Vaughn observed, watching her methodical movements. "Robert was thrown from a horse last spring," Nora explained, securing the bandage. 3 broken ribs and a dislocated shoulder. Doctor showed me how to bind wounds properly." The admission brought Robert's memory sharply into focus. He had been so grateful for her care, so certain they would have many more years together. The familiar ache of loss tightened Nora's throat. "He was fortunate to have you," Vaughn said quietly, as though reading her thoughts. Nora completed her task in silence, then helped Vaughn into one of Robert's clean shirts. It was slightly too small across the shoulders but would serve until his own dried by the fire. Outside, the storm arrived in earnest. Rain lashed against the windows and thunder rumbled continuously overhead. Nora busied herself preparing a simple supper, grateful for the distraction from her conflicted emotions. "The horses," Vaughn said suddenly, attempting to rise. "I left them in the orchard. Already taken care of," Nora assured him, gently pressing him back into the chair. "I put them in the small barn while you were resting. They're dry and fed." Relief softened his features. "Thank you, that gray mare's been with me for years, more friend than mount." "She's beautiful," Nora said, stirring a pot of stew. "What's her name?" "Liberty." Vaughn's expression turned sheepish. "Named her when I was 18 and first left home. Thought it sounded poetic at the time. It suits her." Nora set 2 bowls on the table. "Can you make it to the table, or shall I bring your supper to you?" Vaughn insisted on joining her, moving stiffly but with determined dignity. They ate by lamplight as the storm raged outside, the conversation turning to safer topics: the quality of that season's apples, the prospects for winter weather, news from the nearest town. "Will you stay in Pinecrest after the roundup?" Nora asked as they finished their meal. Vaughn considered the question, his expression thoughtful. Hadn't planned to, always move on when the work dries up. Always the wanderer, Nora said lightly, though she felt an unexpected pang at the thought of his departure. Haven't found a reason to be anything else. His eyes met hers across the table. Not yet, anyway. The air between them seemed to thicken. Nora busied herself clearing the dishes, suddenly aware of the impropriety of their situation, a widow and a single man alone in a remote cabin during a storm. The town would buzz with gossip if anyone knew. You should take the bed, she said briskly. Your ribs need proper rest. I'll make up a pallet by the fire. I'll take the floor, Vaughn countered. Wouldn't dream of displacing you from your bed. Don't be foolish. You're injured, and the floor will only make it worse. Nora's tone was firm. Besides, it's the least I can do after your help with the harvest. Their dispute ended in compromise. Nora would take the bed, but only after Vaughn allowed her to check his bandages one final time. The storm continued unabated as they prepared for sleep, rain drumming steadily against the roof and occasional lightning illuminating the cabin in brief, stark flashes. Later, lying in her bed behind the curtain, Nora listened to Vaughn's steady breathing across the room. Sleep eluded her, her mind filled with confusion and unexpected longing. She had not felt such stirrings since the early days of her marriage. To experience them now, for a man she barely knew, seemed a betrayal of Robert's memory. Yet as lightning briefly illuminated the cabin, revealing Vaughn's silhouette near the fire, Nora acknowledged the truth she had been avoiding. Life continued, even when beloved hearts stopped beating, and her own heart, despite grief and guilt, still yearned for connection. Morning arrived with lingering rain but diminished wind. Nora rose early, carefully moving around the cabin to avoid waking Vaughn, who slept soundly in the chair she'd insisted he take instead of the floor. She built up the fire and prepared coffee, watching as gray light gradually brightened the windows. "Good morning." Vaughn's voice startled her. He sat up cautiously, testing his injured side. "How long have you been up?" "Not long." Nora brought him coffee. "How do you feel?" "Better than I deserve, thanks to your care." He accepted the cup gratefully. "Though I fear I've been poor company falling asleep so early. You needed the rest." Nora busied herself with breakfast preparations, suddenly shy in the morning light. The intensity of her feelings the night before seemed foolish now. "The rain's letting up. You should be able to ride back to the ranch once the track's dry." If Vaughn noticed her cooler demeanor, he gave no indication. They shared a quiet breakfast, and he insisted on helping with the dishes despite her protests. The domesticity of the scene struck Nora forcefully, how natural it felt to share these simple tasks with him, how the cabin seemed less empty with his presence. By mid-morning, the rain had stopped entirely, though heavy clouds still hung low in the sky. Vaughn retrieved his dry clothes and changed behind the privacy screen, emerging looking more like himself despite the careful way he moved. "I should check on the orchard," Nora said. "See what damage the storm did." "I'll come with you," Vaughn offered. "My ribs are sore, but I can still walk." They ventured outside together, surveying the orchard in the gray morning light. The storm had stripped many remaining apples from the trees, but most had already been harvested thanks to their efforts. The ground was littered with fallen fruit and broken branches. "Not as bad as it could have been," Vaughn observed, bending carefully to examine a downed limb. "Most of your crop is already safely gathered. Thanks to you." Nora turned to face him fully. "I couldn't have managed alone." "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for," Vaughn's voice was gentle. "You would have found a way." Nora shook her head. "Perhaps eventually." "But your help meant everything." She hesitated, then added more softly, "as did your company." Something shifted in Vaughn's expression, hope mingled with uncertainty. "Nora, you should go," she interrupted, suddenly afraid of what he might say or what she might answer. "Your employer will be wondering where you are." Disappointment flickered across his features, but he nodded. "Of course, I've imposed long enough." They walked in silence to the barn where the horses waited. Vaughn checked his tack methodically, his movements deliberate despite his injury. When everything was secure, he turned to Nora. "Thank you for your hospitality," he said formally, "and your medical attention. It was the least I could do." Nora stood with her arms wrapped around herself, fighting conflicting impulses. "Will you?" "That is, do you expect to finish the roundup soon? Another 2 weeks, most likely. Then the ranch hands will thin for winter. And you'll move on." It wasn't a question. Vaughn studied her face. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether there's reason to stay." His directness was both terrifying and exhilarating. Nora took a step backward. "I can't. It's too soon. Robert hasn't even been gone a year." "I understand." Vaughn mounted carefully, wincing as the movement pulled at his ribs. "But I'll be in Pinecrest for 2 more weeks if you change your mind about needing help with anything." Nora nodded, unable to trust her voice. She watched as he rode away, the emptiness returning to settle around her like a familiar cloak. The days that followed were filled with activity, taking the harvested apples to market, preserving the remainder, preparing the orchard for winter. Nora threw herself into the work, trying to ignore the hollow feeling that persisted despite her best efforts. A week passed without word from Vaughn. Nora told herself it was for the best, that their brief connection had been nothing more than the natural result of proximity and shared labor. Yet she found herself watching the road each afternoon, hoping for the sight of a dappled gray mare. On market day, Nora drove her wagon into Pinecrest, her remaining apples carefully packed for sale. The town was busier than usual, preparations for winter evident in the increased activity around the general store. She had just finished unloading her goods when a familiar voice called her name. "Mrs. Saunders, a moment of your time, please." Charles Hollister, the store's proprietor, hurried toward her with unusual urgency. "Been meaning to speak with you. Got a letter here, came with the mail coach 3 days back." Nora accepted the envelope with surprise. She received little correspondence, having no family remaining back east. The handwriting was unfamiliar. "Also," Hollister continued, lowering his voice, "thought you should know about the trouble at Rockingham." Nora's attention sharpened. "What trouble?" "Rustlers hit them hard 2 nights ago. Stole 20 head and shot 2 ranch hands who tried to stop them." Hollister shook his head gravely. "One of them died yesterday, other one's holding on but barely." Cold dread washed over Nora. "Do you know who was injured?" "Can't recall the names. One was a newer hand, I heard." "Big fellow who'd been working the fall roundup." Without waiting to hear more, Nora climbed into her wagon and turned toward the doctor's house on the edge of town. Her heart pounded painfully against her ribs as she urged the horses to a faster pace. Dr. Miller's small infirmary was attached to his home, a tidy white building with green shutters. Nora tied her horses hastily and rushed inside, nearly colliding with the doctor's wife in the narrow hallway. "Mrs. Saunders, whatever is the matter?" "The injured ranch hands," Nora said breathlessly. "From Rockingham, are they here?" Mrs. Miller's expression softened with understanding. "Only one now, dear. The younger man passed on yesterday, God rest his soul. The other is in the back room, doctor's with him now." "Please," Nora whispered, "I need to know if he's." Before she could finish, the back door opened and Dr. Miller emerged, looking tired but satisfied. "Fever's broken," he announced. "Think he'll pull through after all. Man's got the constitution of an ox." "May I see him?" Nora asked, her voice trembling slightly. Dr. Miller hesitated. "He's very weak, Mrs. Saunders. Lost a fair amount of blood from that bullet wound. Please, I need to know if it's someone I know." Something in her expression must have conveyed the depth of her concern, for the doctor nodded reluctantly. 5 minutes only. "He needs rest more than company." Nora followed him to a small room at the rear of the house. Sunlight filtered through thin curtains, illuminating a narrow bed where a man lay motionless beneath clean sheets. Nora approached slowly, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't Vaughn. Relief flooded through her with such intensity that her knees weakened. The injured man was older, with graying hair and a weathered face she didn't recognize. Mumbling an apology to the confused doctor, Nora retreated quickly from the room. Outside in the fresh air, she leaned against a hitching post, trembling with the aftermath of fear and relief. Only then did she remember the letter still clutched in her hand. Breaking the seal, she unfolded a single page covered in bold, slanting handwriting. "Nora," it began simply. "By the time you read this, I'll be gone from Pinecrest. Not by choice, but by necessity. The ranch foreman received word that rustlers were targeting Rockingham stock, and he sent several of us ahead with the most valuable horses to the safety of the main property near Cheyenne. I couldn't leave without telling you how much our brief acquaintance has meant to me. In your orchard, I found something I didn't know. I was seeking a sense of purpose beyond the next horizon. A feeling of connection I thought I'd never experience again after losing my family. I understand your hesitation. Grief keeps its own schedule and hearts heal at different rates. But when you gathered apples alongside me, when you tended my injured ribs with such gentle care, I glimpsed the possibility of a future I never dared imagine for myself. I'll return to Pinecrest in 1 month's time when my obligation to Rockingham concludes. If you wish to explore what might exist between us, I'll be at the Harvest Dance on November 15th. If you don't come, I'll understand and trouble you no further. Whatever you decide, know that for 3 days in your orchard, you reminded me what it means to feel truly alive. Yours with respect and hope, Vaughn." Nora read the letter twice more, each word resonating with emotions she had been trying to suppress. The date at the top was 5 days earlier before the rustler attack. Vaughn had already been gone when the violence occurred. For the first time since Robert's death, Nora felt the rigid shell of grief crack open, allowing something new to grow in its place. Not replacement for what she had lost, but the possibility of a different kind of happiness. The following weeks passed both too quickly and too slowly. Nora finished preparing the orchard for winter, banking soil around the youngest trees and pruning damaged branches. Each day in the familiar rows brought memories of Robert's passionate plans, of Vaughn's unexpected assistance, of her own growing recognition that life continued even through loss. The letter remained on her bedside table, its corners softening from frequent handling. Each night, Nora read it before sleep, weighing her fears against the undeniable yearning for companionship. Robert would not have wanted her to be alone forever. This truth, which had seemed impossible to accept months earlier, now settled into her heart with gentle certainty. He had loved life too much to expect her to spend the remainder of hers in solitary mourning. When November 15th arrived, Nora stood before her wardrobe, fingers tracing the single dress that wasn't black or gray. She had not worn the blue calico since before Robert's illness, its cheerful pattern having no place in her grief. Yet tonight, as sunset painted the orchard in golden light, Nora removed the dress from its hooks. The fabric felt both familiar and foreign in her hands, like a piece of her former self waiting to be reclaimed. An hour later, she guided her wagon toward town, heart fluttering with anticipation and uncertainty. Music drifted from the town hall as she approached, lanterns illuminating the building against the early darkness of autumn evening. Nora hesitated at the entrance, suddenly doubtful. What if he wasn't there? What if he had changed his mind? Or worse, what if seeing him confirmed that her feelings were merely the product of loneliness rather than genuine connection? Before she could retreat, the door opened, spilling light and music into the night. Vaughn stood framed in the doorway, tall and solid, his expression shifting from hope to joy as he recognized her. "You came," he said simply. As though those 2 words contained all possible meaning, Nora nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening her throat. He extended his hand, and after only a moment's hesitation, she took it, allowing him to lead her into the warmth and light. They danced only once that evening, moving carefully to accommodate the lingering tenderness of his healed ribs. But in that single dance, with his hand steady at her waist and his eyes never leaving hers, Nora recognized the truth that had been growing since that first day among the apple trees. Life offered no guarantees of permanence, not for Robert, not for her, not for the man whose arms now held her with such gentle respect. But it did offer the possibility of beginning again, of finding new joy without diminishing what came before. As the music ended, Vaughn leaned closer, his voice meant for her ears alone. "I've made an offer on the Peterson place," he said. "The small homestead that borders your orchard to the west." Surprise and something warmer bloomed in Nora's chest. "You're staying in Pinecrest." "If that's agreeable to you." His expression held a vulnerability that touched her deeply. "I thought perhaps we could get to know each other properly." No storms, no injuries, no rushing to finish a harvest, just two people discovering if what we felt in that orchard might grow into something lasting. Nora's smile came easily, without the weight of guilt that had burdened her for so long. "I'd like that very much." Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, dusting the town in pristine white, not an ending, but a new beginning. Like the apple trees in Nora's orchard, dormant but alive with possibility, waiting for the proper season to bloom once more.